Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Hangover of the Century. The sunlight didn't just enter the room, it attacked. Clark Silverton groaned, the sound vibrating painfully against the roof of his mouth. His head felt like it had been used as a testing site for a new line of high-impact jackhammers. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to piece together the shattered glass of his memory. The neon gala. That was the last thing he remembered clearly. He had been drowning his sorrows in top-shelf gin after a disastrous meeting with his venture capitalists. Arise, the AI-driven healthcare platform he'd poured his soul, his inheritance, and 3 years of his life into, was hemorrhaging cash. He had gone to Vegas to find a miracle. Instead, he'd found a shark. "You're making that face again, Silverton. The one where you look like you're trying to calculate the trajectory of your own demise." The voice was deep, smooth, and utterly terrifying. It was a voice Clark heard in his nightmares and across the mahogany tables of every boardroom he'd ever lost in. Clark's eyes snapped open. He winced at the glare, rolling onto his side. The luxury linens of the Caesar's Palace penthouse felt far too expensive for his current bank balance. Sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing nothing but silk pajama bottoms and a smirk that should have been illegal, was Joseph Windsor. Joseph was the golden boy of Silicon Valley. He was the man who had outbid Clark for the Helix patents. The man who had once called Ariza's user interface charming, in a high school science fair sort of way. "Windsor." Clark's voice was a dry rasp. "Why are you in my room?" "Technically," Joseph said, standing up and crossing the room with the predatory grace of a man who worked out at 5 a.m. even on vacation, "this is our room. And you're the one who insisted on the upgrade. You said, and I quote, 'If I'm going to sell my soul, I want a walk-in shower.' I don't, what?" Clark sat up, the duvet pooling around his waist. As he reached up to rub his temples, something caught the light. A heavy, polished gold band sat snugly at the base of his ring finger. Clark froze. His heart did a slow, sickening somersault. He looked at the ring, then at Joseph, who was currently sipping an espresso and holding up a matching gold band on his own hand. "No," Clark whispered. "No, no, no. We were fighting. We were at the bar, and you were mocking my burn rate, and I told you that you were a heartless corporate machine. And I told you that the only way to save a failing mess like you was under my direct management," Joseph interrupted, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and something Clark couldn't quite decipher. "One thing led to another. You called my bluff. I called yours. We found a 24-hour chapel that accepts American Express and high blood alcohol content consent." Clark scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over a discarded tuxedo jacket. "It's not legal. It can't be. We'll get an annulment. We'll call the lawyers. If the board finds out I've married my chief competitor, they'll what, Clark? Fire you?" Joseph set the espresso cup down with a sharp clack. He stepped into Clark's personal space, smelling of expensive sandalwood and terrifying competence. "The board is already gone. Your CTO, Brooks, has been blowing up your phone for 3 hours. The bridge loan fell through. You're flatlining." Clark's breath hitched. The reality of the company's collapse hit him harder than the hangover. "How do you know that?" "Because I was the one they called to buy the remains," Joseph said softly. He reached out, his thumb grazing the gold ring on Clark's shaking hand. "But I don't want the remains, Clark. I want the whole thing. And as of 3:42 a.m., your debts are legally my debts. Your company is my company." Clark looked into Joseph's eyes, searching for the cruelty he'd known for years, but he found a strange, ruthless resolve instead. "Congratulations, Clark," Joseph murmured, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You've just been acquired." Chapter 2, The Bankruptcy Bombshell. The private jet ride back to San Francisco was conducted in a silence so thick it felt structural. Clark stared out the window at the shifting cloud carpet, his left hand shoved deep into his pocket. The gold band felt like a thermal detonator against his skin, heavy, hot, and capable of leveling his entire life if he moved too quickly. Across the aisle, Joseph Windsor was already at work. He hadn't changed into a flight suit or relaxed, he sat in a crisp charcoal suit, the glow of his tablet illuminating a face that looked entirely too refreshed for a man who had been married in a neon-lit chapel 6 hours prior. "Stop fidgeting, Clark," Joseph said, not looking up from a spreadsheet. "The stress hormones are rolling off you in waves. It's bad for your cognitive function." "My cognitive function is currently occupied by the fact that I sold my soul to a man who once tried to patent the concept of a rounded corner," Clark snapped. Joseph finally looked up, his gaze cool and analytical. "I didn't buy your soul. I bought your debt. There's a distinct legal difference. And for the record, I didn't try to patent the corner, I patented the algorithm that optimized it. Details matter." When they reached the Arise headquarters, the atmosphere was less tech unicorn and more sinking ship. Employees were gathered in small, hushed clusters near the micro-kitchen. The espresso machine, usually the heartbeat of the office, sat cold and neglected. Standing at the center of the chaos was Shawn Brooks. Shawn was the quintessential CTO, brilliant, slightly disheveled, and fiercely loyal. He had been Clark's right hand since the garage days. When he saw Clark walk through the glass doors, his face flooded with relief that vanished the instant he saw who was walking 3 inches behind him. "Clark." "Thank God," Shawn started, rushing forward. "The New York firm pulled the plug. They're calling it market volatility, but we know it's cold feet. I've been trying to reach you all night, but your phone was." Shawn stopped dead, his eyes dropping to the space where Joseph's hand rested, possessively, Clark realized with a jolt, on the small of Clark's back. "Windsor." Shawn's voice dropped an octave, turning jagged. "What is he doing here?" "This is a closed office, Joseph. We're in the middle of a crisis." "Which is exactly why I'm here." Joseph stepped forward, his presence expanding to fill the lobby. He didn't just walk into a room, he annexed it. "As of this morning, Arise has undergone a radical restructuring. I've personally cleared the outstanding payroll debt and secured a bridge loan through Windsor Capital." Shawn looked at Clark, his expression pleading. "Clark, tell me he's joking. You didn't take money from him. We discussed this. I told you I had a lead on a private equity group that could save us by Friday. I was going to handle it." Clark felt a twinge of guilt. Shawn had always wanted to be the hero, the one to keep the lights on while Clark focused on the vision. But Friday was too late. "Shawn, the PE group wasn't coming through," Clark said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We were out of time." "Joseph," he stepped in. "Stepped in." Shawn let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "He's been trying to cannibalize us for 3 years. What did you have to give him?" "What was the price, Clark?" Joseph didn't wait for Clark to answer. He reached out and took Clark's left hand, lifting it just enough so the wedding band caught the overhead LED lights. "The price," Joseph said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register, "was total access. I am now the co-CEO of Arise. And as Clark's husband, I have a vested interest in ensuring this company, and its founder, don't fail." The silence that followed was deafening. Shawn looked like he'd been struck. His gaze darted between the ring and Clark's pale face, his knuckles widening as he gripped his tablet. "Husband." Shawn whispered, the word tasting like poison. "You married him. In a night. You threw away everything we built for a bailout from a shark." "It wasn't like that, Shawn," Clark started, but Joseph's hand tightened slightly on his. "It's exactly like that," Joseph countered. "Now, Brooks, if you're done grieving the loss of your independence, I'd like to see the server logs for the last quarter. We're trimming the fat, and I suspect there's a lot of waste in the dev department." Shawn didn't move. He stared at Joseph with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing before turning his eyes back to Clark. You have no idea what you've just let into this house, Clark. You think he's saving you? He's just waiting for the right moment to turn off the oxygen. Without another word, Shawn turned and stormed toward the server room, his gait stiff with a fury that felt far more personal than professional. Clark slumped against a nearby desk, the adrenaline fading into a cold realization. He hates you. And now he hates me. He'll get over it, Joseph said, opening his laptop as if he hadn't just detonated a social bomb. Or he won't. Either way, the payroll cleared 5 minutes ago. You're welcome. Chapter 3, Forced Proximity and Friction. The restructuring didn't start with the servers, it started with Clark's morning coffee. That 60% sugar and 40% chemical sludge, Joseph remarked, not looking up from a translucent holographic display as Clark stumbled into the Arise kitchenette. Joseph was already there, impeccably dressed in a navy vest that made him look like he'd stepped off a yacht rather than out of a boardroom brawl. It's a mocha latte chino, and it's the only thing keeping my heart beating, Clark muttered, clutching his paper cup like a holy relic. Your heart is beating because I cleared your credit line, Joseph countered. He reached out, plucked the cup from Clark's hand, and dropped it into the trash with a ruthless thunk. He replaced it with a ceramic mug of dark, artisanal roast. Drink this. It's a single origin bean from a farm I practically own. It'll sharpen your focus instead of rotting your teeth. Clark stared at the mug, then at Joseph. This was Chapter 3 of the Windsor takeover, domestic micromanagement. For the next 6 hours, the Arise conference room, affectionately dubbed the think tank, felt more like a courtroom. Joseph had pinned the company's entire roadmap to the glass walls. Red digital ink slashed through projects Clark had nurtured for years. The BioSync module. Scrapped, Joseph said, his finger swiping the air to delete a core file. The modular interface. Too expensive. We're stripping Arise down to its predictive diagnostic engine. It's the only thing you have that actually scales. You're gutting the soul of the platform. Clark stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. The BioSync is why people use Arise. It makes the tech feel human. You're turning it into a cold, clinical calculator. I'm turning it into a profitable company, Clark, Joseph said, his voice dropping to that low, vibrating frequency that always made Clark's pulse jump, half in anger, half in something he refused to name. You've been playing house with a venture that was 3 weeks from a going out of business sign. I'm giving you a foundation. I'm the floor, Clark. You're the ceiling. Stop fighting the thing that's keeping you from falling. By 2 a.m., the office was a ghost town. The cleaning crews had come and gone, leaving the scent of lemon bleach and ozone. Clark sat at his workstation, eyes stinging from the blue light of his monitors. He was trying to rewrite the diagnostic engine to include at least a fraction of the BioSync's empathy, but he kept hitting a logic wall. A shadow fell over his desk. Joseph was leaning against the cubicle wall, his tie loosened, the first sign of disarray Clark had ever seen on the man. Line 402, Joseph said softly. The pointer is null. You're trying to call a function that doesn't exist yet. I know that, Clark lied, his voice thick with exhaustion. I'm just conceptualizing. Move. Joseph didn't wait for permission. He leaned over Clark, one hand on the back of the chair and the other on the desk, effectively caging him. The scent of sandalwood and expensive espresso enveloped Clark. Joseph's fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard with a speed that was almost hypnotic. As the code scrolled by, Clark realized something terrifying. Joseph wasn't just a suit with a checkbook. He was a master architect. He was fixing the logic holes Clark had been struggling with for months in a matter of minutes. There, Joseph whispered. His breath brushed against Clark's ear, sending a traitorous shiver down his spine. It's efficient. It's clean. And it still keeps your human touch in the metadata. Clark looked up, his face inches from Joseph's. For a moment, the rivalry, the bankruptcy, and the accidental wedding ring vanished. There was just the hum of the servers and the heat between them. "Why?" Clark asked, his voice barely a breath. "If you're this good, you could have built this yourself. You didn't need to buy me." Joseph's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping to Clark's mouth before snapping back up to his eyes. "Building it myself wouldn't have given me the one thing I actually wanted, Clark." Before Clark could ask what that was, a sharp click echoed through the darkened office. They both turned. At the far end of the hallway, the light from the server room flickered. A silhouette, unmistakably Shawn Brooks, stood there, frozen. He had been watching them, his face a mask of wounded fury, before he vanished into the shadows of the lab. The moment was shattered. Joseph pushed off the desk, his professional mask sliding back into place as if it had never moved. "Get some sleep, Clark," Joseph said, his voice cold once more. "We have a board meeting at 8. And try not to wear that hoodie. You're a married man now, dress like you own the place." Chapter 4, The Third Wheel's Grudge. The glow of the server room was a sickly, rhythmic blue, pulsing like a failing heart. Shawn Brooks sat in the dark, the light of his triple monitor setup reflecting off his glasses. On one screen was the core architecture of Arise, the human AI he had helped Clark build from a series of frantic late-night sketches. On the other was a secure, encrypted chat window with a black background. His fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard, but they were shaking. "He doesn't see you, Shawn," a voice in his head whispered, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his own insecurities. "He only sees the shark now." He looked at the security footage on a small side panel. It showed the high-definition replay of 30 minutes ago, Joseph Windsor leaning over Clark at the workstation. The proximity. The way Clark hadn't pulled away. The way Clark had looked at his rival with a spark of something that wasn't hatred. It should have been Shawn. He was the one who had stayed when the first round of funding failed. He was the one who had coded through a double-ear infection to meet the alpha deadline. He had been waiting for the perfect moment to tell Clark how he felt, a moment he thought would come when the company collapsed and he could offer Clark a shoulder to cry on. Instead, Joseph Windsor had bought the shoulder, the company, and the man. "You're making a mistake, Clark," Shawn muttered to the empty room. "I'm just trying to show you who he really is." He clicked a command. A progress bar appeared, extracting core heuristics. 12%. The next morning, the penthouse felt smaller than usual. Clark was struggling with a silk tie, request, from Joseph, when the man himself appeared in the mirror's reflection. "Give it here," Joseph said, his voice devoid of its usual sharp edge. He stepped behind Clark, his chest brushing against Clark's back as he reached around to take the silk fabric. "I can do it," Clark protested, though his hands dropped. "You're strangling yourself," Joseph noted, his fingers working with practiced, elegant precision. "A Windsor knot for a Silverton. It's poetic, in a structural sort of way." Clark looked at Joseph in the mirror. The man looked tired. There were faint shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there in Vegas. "Did you stay up all night on the diagnostic engine?" "I don't sleep well when there's an inefficiency in the room," Joseph replied. He tightened the knot, his knuckles grazing Clark's throat. For a second, his gaze lingered on Clark's lips, and the air in the room seemed to vanish. The moment was shattered by the frantic chirping of Clark's phone. It was an alert from their internal security system. Critical data leak detected. By the time they reached the office, it was a crime scene. Two of the junior devs were staring at their screens in horror. "What happened?" Clark demanded, his voice cracking. "Someone bypassed the firewall from an internal terminal," one of the devs whispered. "The core logic for the predictive engine, it's on a public dark web repository. And a copy was just sent to Vanguard Tech." Vanguard was Joseph's primary competitor, and Arise's biggest threat. "My terminal was accessed," Joseph said, his voice like ice as he checked his remote logs. Someone used my credentials to authorize the dump. Clark felt the world tilt. He looked across the floor to where Shawn was standing by the server room door. Shawn looked pale, his eyes wide with a practiced sort of shock. Joseph? Clark's voice was small, trembling with a sudden, agonizing doubt. Did you just send our tech to your own rivals to tank our valuation? Clark, don't be absurd, Joseph snapped, but his jaw was tight. I'm the one who paid for that tech. Why would I devalue my own asset? Maybe because you want to buy the entire company for pennies instead of just being co-CEO. Shawn stepped forward, his voice dripping with faux concern. I told you, Clark. A shark doesn't stop being a shark just because he puts on a wedding ring. He's sabotaging us from the inside so he can strip mine the patents. Clark looked from Joseph's cold, unreadable face to Shawn's familiar, wounded expression. The gold ring on his finger suddenly felt like a shackle. I need everyone out, Clark whispered, his heart shattering. Now. As the office cleared, Shawn lingered for a second, a small, dark spark of triumph in his eyes. He had done it. He had planted the seeds. Now, he just had to wait for the marriage to wither so he could be the one to pick up the pieces. Chapter 5, Blurred Lines. The flight to the Silicon Summit in Lake Tahoe was not taken on a private jet. It was a silent, claustrophobic drive in Joseph's Audi, the mountain roads winding like the twisted logic of their marriage. The data leak hung between them like a physical barrier, a sheet of frosted glass that neither dared to shatter. I didn't do it, Clark, Joseph said, his hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His knuckles were white. I have enough enemies in this industry without gifting them my own intellectual property. Then why was it your terminal? Clark asked, staring out at the passing pines. Why were your credentials used to authorize the dump to Vanguard? They're your biggest rivals, Joseph. If Arise fails, you can buy the patents from the bankruptcy court for a fraction of what you paid to marry me. Joseph pulled the car over onto a gravel shoulder with a sudden, violent crunch. He killed the engine and turned to Clark, his eyes burning with a cold, desperate fire. If I wanted to destroy you, I would have done it 3 years ago when you mismanaged your Series A, Joseph hissed. I wouldn't have married you in a haze of gin and regret. I wouldn't be spending 18 hours a day fixing your sloppy back-end logic. Use your brain, Clark. I don't build things just to burn them down. Clark looked away, his throat tight. I don't know what to believe anymore. The Ritz-Carlton was teeming with the vultures of the tech world. Every conversation stopped when the power couple of the year entered the ballroom. Clark felt like a specimen under a microscope. He adjusted his cufflinks, a gift from Joseph that morning, and tried to keep his hand from shaking as he held a glass of mineral water. Smile, Clark, Joseph whispered, leaning in close enough that his breath tickled Clark's ear. To the onlookers, it looked like a romantic confidence. To Clark, it felt like a tactical directive. The Vanguard reps are at 10 o'clock. If they see us wavering, they'll know the leak was real and not a controlled release, like we told the press. You lied to the press. I managed the narrative. There's a difference. They spent the night performing a masterclass in corporate theater. Joseph was charming, deflective, and fiercely protective. When a senior analyst tried to corner Clark about Ariza's runway, Joseph stepped in with a sharp wit that dismantled the man's argument before he could finish his sentence. By midnight, the crowd had thinned. They retreated to the balcony overlooking the moonlit lake. The air was crisp, smelling of snow and pine. You're good at this, Clark said, leaning against the stone railing. The acting. The doting husband bit. For a second there, even I almost believed you liked me. Joseph stepped up beside him, his jacket off, draped over one arm. He looked out at the water, his expression softening into something Clark had never seen before, something raw. It wasn't acting, Clark. Not all of it. Clark turned, his heart hammering against his ribs. What are you talking about? Why do you think I was at that bar in Vegas? Joseph asked, his voice low and gravelly. I knew you were there. I knew your funding had dried up. I went there to offer you a merger, a real one. I didn't expect the gin to turn it into a wedding. Joseph turned to face him, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of his face. I've been chasing you for 3 years, Clark. Not to crush you. To catch up to you. You have a brilliance that I can't replicate with all the algorithms in the world. You have a heart. I just wanted to be part of the machine that kept it beating. He reached out, his hand hovering near Clark's cheek before he seemed to lose his nerve. But Clark didn't pull away. Instead, he closed the gap, grabbing Joseph's lapel and pulling him down. The kiss was nothing like the blurry, frantic memory of Vegas. It was slow, tasting of salt and expensive scotch, a collision of two rivals finally lowering their shields. In that moment, the leak didn't matter. The company didn't matter. There was only the heat of Joseph's mouth and the realization that the man Clark thought was his greatest enemy had been his most silent, steadfast admirer. We'll find out who did it, Joseph whispered against his lips, his forehead resting against Clark's. I promise you. No one touches what's mine. Behind them, inside the darkened suite, a laptop screen flickered. A remote connection had been established. From miles away, Shawn Brooks watched the thermal feed of the balcony, his face twisting into something unrecognizable. Chapter 6, The Betrayal. The morning after the summit should have felt like a beginning. Instead, it felt like the edge of a cliff. The drive back to the city was different. The silence wasn't cold anymore, it was heavy with the weight of the kiss on the balcony and the unspoken promises made under the Tahoe stars. Joseph drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the center console, palm up. Clark hesitated for only a second before sliding his hand into Joseph's, their wedding bands clicking together, a small, metallic harmony. But as they walked into the Arise lobby, the harmony was shattered by a wall of sound. Mr. Silverton. Over here. Joseph, is it true you've been funneling Arise data to your private holdings? Clark, care to comment on the Trojan horse allegations? A swarm of tech journalists and a few disgruntled investors had breached the lobby. At the center of the storm stood the Arise board of directors, their faces like stone. And standing behind them, looking like a man who had just witnessed a tragedy, was Shawn Brooks. Into the boardroom. Now, barked Arthur Vance, the lead investor. The doors slammed shut, cutting off the flashbulbs. Joseph tried to take his usual place at the head of the table, but Vance held up a hand. Not today, Windsor. You're here as a person of interest, not a principal. What is this? Clark demanded, stepping in front of Joseph. We were at the summit. We've been working on a recovery plan. The recovery plan looks a lot like a heist, Clark, Shawn said, stepping forward. He held a tablet, his fingers flying across the screen to project a series of documents onto the wall. I did a deep dive into the logs while you two were away. It's worse than the initial leak. There's a secondary script, hidden in the diagnostic engine Joseph fixed the other night. It's been siphoning the user database directly to Windsor Capital's private cloud. Joseph's face went pale, not with guilt, but with a terrifying, cold realization. That's impossible. I wrote that patch myself. It was clean. The metadata says otherwise, Shawn countered, his voice trembling with a convincing mix of anger and betrayal. The timestamp matches the hour you were alone at Clark's terminal. You didn't save the company, Joseph. You just put a leash on it so you could lead it into your own slaughterhouse. Joseph? Clark's voice was a whisper. He looked at the code on the wall. It did look like Joseph's syntax. It had his characteristic efficiency, his ruthless logic. Tell me this is a mistake. Joseph looked at the screen, then at Shawn, and finally at Clark. He saw the doubt creeping into Clark's eyes, the same doubt that had lived there for years of rivalry. Clark, Look at me, Joseph said, ignoring the board members. You know my work. You know I don't leave footprints this sloppy. This is a setup. The evidence is right there. Shawn shouted. He used the marriage as a legal shield to bypass the usual oversight. He's been playing you since Vegas, Clark. He probably drugged your drinks just to get that ring on your finger. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Clark's mind flashed back to the balcony, the vulnerability in Joseph's voice, the way he had confessed to years of silent longing. Was it all part of the acquisition? Was the kiss just a way to keep the mark quiet while the vault was emptied? I want him out, Vance declared. As of this moment, the board is suspending Joseph Windsor's co-CEO status and filing an injunction. And Clark, if you don't sign these papers to distance the company from him, we're filing for Chapter 7 liquidation by noon. The room went silent. The choice was binary: save the company and lose Joseph, or go down with the man who might have just betrayed him. Clark, Joseph said, his voice strangely calm. Do what you have to do to save Arise. Clark felt like he was breathing glass. He looked at the board, then at Shawn, who was watching him with a predatory hope, and finally at the gold band on his finger. With trembling hands, Clark took the pen. He didn't sign the divorce papers, but he signed the suspension order. Leave, Clark said, not looking at Joseph. Joseph didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply adjusted his cuffs, looked at Shawn with a gaze that promised a slow and painful reckoning, and walked out of the room. Later that night, the office was empty. Clark sat in the dark, staring at the fixed code. He felt hollow. Shawn had stayed late, offering to bring Clark dinner, to help him move on, but Clark had sent him away. He began to poke at the script Joseph had supposedly written. He looked at line 1024, a piece of the diagnostic logic. It was perfect. Too perfect. He paused. He remembered Joseph's voice from Chapter 3, the pointer is null. You're trying to call a function that doesn't exist yet. Clark's eyes narrowed. He looked at the siphoning script. It used a specific naming convention for its variables, v_export, v_target. Joseph didn't use underscores. He hated them. He called them visual clutter. Clark felt a cold chill run down his spine. Joseph hadn't written this. Someone had mimicked his style but failed to account for his obsessive-compulsive formatting habits. He opened the access logs for the server room, not the remote logs, but the physical badge-in sensor. The log showed the room was empty. But as Clark pulled the raw hardware data, he saw a manual override from the inside at 3 a.m. Someone hadn't badged in. Someone who had a physical key. Someone who knew exactly how much Clark trusted them. Clark grabbed his coat, his heart pounding a rhythm of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't call the police. He didn't call the board. He called the only person who was ruthless enough to help him burn the real traitor to the ground. Joseph, Clark said when the call connected on the first ring. I'm in the car. I know where he went. And I'm still wearing the ring. Chapter 7, The Vegas Redemption. The desert air was a dry, searing weight as Clark stepped out of the black sedan. They weren't at a boardroom or a high-rise, they were parked in the neon-drenched shadow of the Gilded Lily, the same kitschy, 24-hour chapel where their mistake had been codified into law. Joseph was leaned against the car, his charcoal suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He looked less like a CEO and more like a hitman. He's inside, Joseph said, his voice a low vibration. He thinks he's meeting a representative from Vanguard to finalize the sale of the heuristics. He doesn't know I bought that representative's loyalty 2 hours ago. Clark looked at the chapel's flickering, open, sign. He really thought I was that blind. He thought he could just delete you and I'd fall right into his arms. Shawn is a brilliant coder, Clark, Joseph said, stepping closer, his presence a stabilizing force in the chaotic Vegas night. But he's a terrible strategist. He forgot the first rule of a merger: never leave a disgruntled partner with nothing to lose. Inside, the chapel smelled of stale incense and cheap floor wax. Shawn Brooks sat in a velvet pew, a sleek silver briefcase resting on his knees. He looked up as the doors swung open, expecting a corporate spy. Instead, he found the two men he had tried to tear apart, walking side by side. Shawn's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, terror, and finally, a twisted, jagged sort of resentment. He stood up, clutching the briefcase. "Clark. What are you doing here? You should be at the office. You should be. I should be letting you save me." Clark interrupted, his voice echoing off the plastic floral arrangements. "I checked the hardware logs, Shawn. I checked the variable naming conventions. Joseph hates underscores. You, however, have been using them in your human AI since the day we met." Shawn's eyes darted to Joseph. "He manipulated you. He's a shark, Clark. He's just using this to take the whole company." "If I wanted the company, Shawn, I would have let it fail and bought the scrap metal," Joseph said, his voice dangerously smooth as he stepped into the aisle. "I didn't marry the company. I married the man. Something you were too cowardly to even try." "Cowardly?" Shawn's voice rose to a shriek. "I stayed. I built a rise with him. You just showed up with a checkbook and a wedding ring." "You didn't build it with him," Clark said, feeling a strange, cold clarity. "You built it for him, hoping he'd be too weak to stand without you. You didn't want a partner, Shawn. You wanted a dependent." Shawn lunged for his laptop, his fingers flying. "It doesn't matter. The code is already on a timed release. If I don't enter the heartbeat every 10 minutes, Ariza's entire database goes public. If I go down, the company goes with me." Joseph didn't flinch. He simply pulled a sleek, obsidian-colored tablet from his pocket. "I wouldn't bother, Brooks," Joseph said. "While you were waiting here for your payday, I had my team at Windsor Capital execute a hostile infrastructure takeover. We didn't just block your script, we bought the servers you're hosting it on. You're currently typing into a void." Shawn hit the Enter key with a desperate force. The screen flashed red: access denied, account terminated. The briefcase slipped from Shawn's hands, hitting the carpeted floor with a dull thud. He collapsed back onto the pew, the weight of his own sabotage finally crushing him. "It's over, Shawn," Clark said. There was no triumph in his voice, only a profound exhaustion. "The board has the evidence. The police are waiting outside. You weren't the hero of this story. You were just the bug in the system." As the sirens began to wail in the distance and the police led a silent, broken Shawn away, Clark and Joseph remained in the chapel. The Elvis officiant poked his head out from a back room, looked at the two men, and wisely retreated. Clark turned to Joseph. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the reality of what they had just survived. "You really bought a server farm in 2 hours?" Clark asked, a small, tired smile tugging at his lips. "I told you," Joseph said, closing the distance between them. He reached out, taking Clark's hand, the one with the ring. "I don't like inefficiencies. And having my husband think I'm a corporate spy was a massive inefficiency." Joseph looked around the tacky, tinsel-covered chapel. "We should probably go. This place is a disaster." "Wait," Clark said, his fingers tightening around Joseph's. "Last time we were here, I was too drunk to remember what I said. I want to say it again. Soberly." Joseph froze, his breath hitching. "Clark. Clark Silverton, take you, Joseph Windsor, even if you are a ruthless, arrogant, hating shark." Joseph's eyes softened, the cold CEO mask finally shattering for good. He pulled Clark in, his hand cupping the back of Clark's neck. "And I, Joseph Windsor, take you, Because I've been waiting 3 years for you to realize that I'm the only one who can keep up with you. They didn't need an officiant. They didn't need a contract. Under the buzzing neon lights of a Vegas dive, the merger was finally complete. Chapter 8, The IPO, Intimate Public Offering. The glass-walled headquarters of the newly rebranded Silverton Windsor Nexus didn't look like a startup anymore. It looked like the future. The frantic, desperate energy of the old Arise had been replaced by a calibrated, powerhouse hum. In the center of the lobby, the old Arise logo had been integrated into a new design, a sleek, interlocking weave of light and geometry. Clark Silverton stood in his new office, looking out at the San Francisco skyline. He wasn't wearing a hoodie. He was wearing a tailored navy suit that Joseph had picked out, but he'd kept the top button undone and his sleeves rolled up. Some habits, the human parts of him, refused to be restructured. "You're staring again," a voice drawled from the doorway. Clark turned to see Joseph. He looked different these days. The predatory sharpness was still there, but it was tempered by a strange, newfound peace. He walked over to Clark, handed him a tablet, and leaned against the mahogany desk. "The IPO closed 10 minutes ago," Joseph said, his voice quiet. "We're the most successful tech merger in the last decade. The spousal acquisition worked." Clark laughed, leaning back against the glass. "Is that what we're calling it now? I thought it was a hostile takeover of the heart." "Don't be sentimental, it ruins the brand," Joseph teased, though he reached out and took Clark's hand, his thumb tracing the gold band that had never left Clark's finger. Life after the Vegas redemption had been a whirlwind. Shawn Brooks was serving time for corporate espionage, his legacy at the company erased and replaced by a dev team that actually respected Clark's vision. Joseph hadn't absorbed Arise, he had fortified it. He had become the shield that allowed Clark to keep dreaming. But the real work had been the marriage. They had spent the last 6 months learning that being rivals was easy, but being partners was a constant negotiation. They still argued, mostly about server latency and Joseph's insistence on optimized breakfast schedules, but the arguments always ended with a kiss that tasted like victory. "The car is waiting," Joseph reminded him. "If we're late to our own party, the board will start a rumor that we're getting a divorce just to manipulate the stock price." "Let them talk," Clark said, pulling Joseph closer by his silk tie. "I think they like the drama. It's good for the algorithm." They didn't go to a ballroom for the official wedding. They went to a private garden overlooking the bay, filled with the people who had actually supported them through the chaos. There were no press, no vultures, and no hidden agendas. As they stood before a small group of friends, the officiant, a real one this time, asked for the rings. Clark looked down at the gold band he'd been wearing since that blurry night in Vegas. It was scratched now, worn from months of work and stress, but to him, it was more beautiful than any flawless diamond. "Joseph," Clark began, his voice steady. "6 months ago, I thought you were the man who was going to take everything from me. It turns out, you were the only one who knew what I was worth. You saved my company, but more importantly, you made me realize I didn't have to build the world alone." Joseph took a breath, his composure wavering for the first time in his professional life. "Clark. I spent years trying to beat you because I was afraid that if I wasn't your rival, I'd be nothing to you. I'm done competing. From now on, the only thing I'm interested in winning is your trust. Every single day." As they exchanged a new set of rings, platinum this time, engraved with the coordinates of that little chapel in Vegas, the sun began to set over the Golden Gate Bridge. Later that night, away from the toasts and the champagne, they sat on the balcony of their shared penthouse. The city lights twinkled like lines of code below them. "So," Clark said, leaning his head on Joseph's shoulder. "What's the next move, Mr. Co-CEO? Expansion? A new patent? International markets?" Joseph pulled Clark closer, the warmth of the evening wrapping around them. He looked at his husband, his partner, his former enemy, his best friend, and smiled. "The next move," Joseph whispered, is to turn off our phones, ignore the servers, and spend at least 8 hours being incredibly inefficient. Clark grinned, closing his eyes. Now that is a strategic intervention I can get behind. Thank you for listening under the same moon. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome here. Good night.